The purpose of this meeting is just to more or less kickstart the campaign to repeal the blasphemy clause from the Irish Constitution. There's a referendum on October the 26th, which is the same day as the presidential election, and we'll be asked on that day to vote whether or not to remove that clause from the Constitution. Now, we're starting from a very low level of public awareness of this campaign. So, first of all, we're going to have to explain to people what the blasphemy law is and what the background to it is, and then we're going to have to ensure that people realise that it's an important issue, because there's a danger that people might see it as peripheral, and then we need to figure out how we're going to campaign against the likely arguments that will be used to maintain the blasphemy clause in the Constitution. So I'll start off by giving a brief outline to the history of the blasphemy law, how it got to be in our Constitution and why it's important to remove it. And it goes back to 1937 when the Constitution was first put in place. And there's a clause in the Constitution saying that blasphemy is an offence which is punishable in accordance with law. So it's the Constitution that makes blasphemy a crime in Ireland. The punishment has to be put in place by the legislature, but it is the Constitution that causes blasphemy to be a crime in Ireland. That's why we need a referendum to remove it as a crime in Ireland. Now, the only time that that law was properly tested was in the 1990s. And it was after one of the divorce referendums. It was the divorce referendum where divorce was legalised. And one of the newspapers published a cartoon of two politicians, or three politicians, I think it was the Fine Gael, Labour and Democratic left leaders, responding to one of the campaign slogans of the anti-divorce side, and that slogan was "Hello divorce, goodbye daddy." And so this cartoon was of a priest offering communion to the three political leaders, and they were turning away from the priest, and the slogan underneath was "Hello divorce, goodbye father." So that was the cartoon that there was a case taken against on the basis that it was blasphemous. And the courts found that they couldn't proceed with the case because the law didn't define what the offence of blasphemy consisted of. And so that left us in a situation where we still did have a law against blasphemy on the books, but the courts had determined that it couldn't be enforced. And so in effect it wasn't there. It was kind of just a dead law that was there but not enforceable. The law against blasphemy resided within the Defamation Act. And in 2008, the Defamation Act itself was being reviewed. Not about blasphemy, but generally the whole Defamation Act. And as part of that, everybody assumed that the government would take that opportunity to just remove the offence of blasphemy. And indeed, in the first few iterations of that law as it was going through the Parliament, there was no reference to blasphemy. But then at the last minute, Dermot Ahern, who was the Minister for Justice, in fact he was the third Minister for Justice during the period that that bill was going through the legislature, he decided at the last minute to add in a definition of blasphemy. Now, he claimed that it was because they're constitutionally obliged to make it punishable, but he put in this definition which essentially says that it is against the law to say or publish something that is grossly offensive in relation to matters held sacred by any religion, thereby causing outrage among a substantial number of adherents of that religion. And then there's various defences against that, but that's the essence of the law. So there's a number of problems with the law which aren't particularly relevant to the referendum, because the referendum is just about getting rid of the offence itself. If you remedy those problems with the law, that still wouldn't get rid of the fact that it is still an offence in the Constitution. So the key thing is that blasphemy should not be in the Constitution. There's a large number of bodies that have reviewed the Irish Constitution over the years. Back in the 90s there was a Constitutional Review Group, there's been all-party Oireachtas committees, there have been UN human rights committees, there's the Venice Commission, which is the Council of Europe's body for advising governments on constitutional matters. So there's any number of bodies that have looked at this and said it has to go. It's not compatible with a modern democratic republic. It's just an anachronistic law that should be removed. So there are two reasons that it should be removed from our perspective. The first is, even though it hasn't been formally enforced since Dermot Ahern brought it in, it has caused a kind of soft censorship whereby the media choose to self-censor themselves. Because in fairness to the media, if you're setting up a local newspaper or a television station, or even if you're running RTE, your priority isn't to challenge the laws of the land. Your priority is to run your media outlet with the least amount of hassle and the most amount of profit for your shareholders. So our experience is that media outlets will just not publish anything that even looks as if it might get into a blasphemy argument, even if they felt confident of winning it, because they just don't want to get involved in that area. And so I have been told before live interviews, on broadcast interviews, make sure you don't say anything that breaches the blasphemy law. We have had articles that we're aware of that people have submitted and had published in various print publications where things have been edited out because of concerns that they might be blasphemous. So it is happening. The self-censorship is happening, even though the law hasn't been formally enforced. And the one time that it looked as if it might have been enforced a couple of years ago, when Stephen Fry said something on the Gay Byrne show about the Christian God that people thought might have been blasphemous, somebody made a complaint. The police investigated that complaint, and they concluded that they couldn't go ahead with it in that particular case, because one of the tests in the Act, in fact the first real test in the Act, is that it has to have caused outrage among a substantial number of adherents of the religion. And they said that there hasn't been demonstrated public outrage, so therefore the offence hasn't been committed. But now that's very dangerous, because essentially that means that if hypothetically, if there was another Charlie Hebdo situation and somebody published cartoons that offended the extreme end of fundamentalist Islam, and they came to the police and said, we want a blasphemy case taken against this cartoon, all that the police could say is, well, we haven't seen public outrage. And, you know, they're the last group of people that you want to be incentivising to show public outrage. So this law is irresponsible in that it incentivises unhelpful antisocial behaviour, where we should be trying to incentivise people to respond more rationally and proportionally if somebody says something that they disagree with, however strongly they disagree with it. So that's the first reason that we think that it's important to remove the blasphemy clause from our constitution. It's an anachronistic and harmful law, regardless of whether or not it's formally implemented. The second reason, which has a stronger impact, is that internationally, the Islamic states at the United Nations, when we passed our law, immediately started, this is when we passed our law in 2010 rather than the 1937 constitution, immediately started to incorporate wording from the Irish law as part of what they wanted implemented around the world to prevent criticism of religion. When we were raising this issue at the Constitutional Convention, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief gave us some quotes to bring to that convention, saying that he felt that he was concerned that this was the big issue with regard to the Irish blasphemy law, that states that persecute people on the basis of far more authoritarian blasphemy laws like to point to the hypocrisy of Western states in telling them to stop doing what they're doing while we have blasphemy laws on our books. And the Irish one is particularly important in that context because, unlike some other states that have anachronistic blasphemy laws on their books that have been there for decades or even centuries, but they just haven't got rid of them yet, the Irish law is a new law. We're the only democratic state in the Western world to pass a new blasphemy law in the 21st century. So those are the two main reasons that we think it's important to campaign to repeal the Irish blasphemy law. Firstly, in terms of our national issues, it is harmful whether or not it is officially implemented, because it causes a soft censorship and the media to self-censor itself, and also it incentivises public outrage when we need to be incentivising responsible behaviour. And then secondly, in terms of the international impact, it contributes to emboldening authoritarian states that persecute people, and not just atheists. And this campaign is not an atheist campaign. One of the people that we campaign for in Pakistan is a Christian woman called Asia Bibi, who's facing execution for blasphemy in Pakistan, because what she had basically a row with her neighbours. And what tends to happen in those states is rows between neighbours tend to be translated into blasphemy allegations. A mob will come to attack the person concerned, and the police will come, and instead of dispersing the mob, they will arrest the person concerned and charge them with blasphemy. So we have both the national and international aspects of the campaign. And indeed the Minister for Justice, when announcing the referendum, himself highlighted the international aspect and said that this is damaging to Ireland's reputation abroad. And while it is damaging to our reputation, it is more importantly damaging to individuals living in those states, who we as citizens of the world have a duty to help protect them from the type of persecution that they face.